Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Stephanie Gaspar, president of Kissimmeevalleyaudubonsociety, and appreciate everyone watching. I want to give a special thanks to Brian Camerano for joining us last month for his program about life on a seabird nesting island located on Stratton Island in Maine. If you haven't seen the program yet, be sure to watch as it's a very unique peek into the life of a field biologist. Additionally, we are still seeking members to join our board of directors. There are positions available, so please get in touch if you are interested. Our contact information is in the description below. If you would like to join our chapter, be added to our email list, or volunteer, please send us a message and we'll get back to you. Stay up to date with our programs by checking our website, following us on Facebook, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Before we begin, I would like to mention a few housekeeping items. Log into YouTube and type any questions you have in the chat. Questions can be asked throughout the presentation and afterwards as well. I'm happy to introduce tonight's guest, Dr. Eunice Laurent. She is a biology professor and academic discipline coordinator for the science department at Valencia College, Poinciana Campus. She was also my biology 2 professor at Valencia, and it was one of my favorite and most memorable classes. We often hear about the negative impacts of human actions on the environment. Sometimes these actions can be well meant and at other times unintentional. However, because many of our actions I lost my place. Because many of our actions and decisions revolve around our well-being, the chance of adjusting our lifestyle to suit other organisms is very small. So unfortunately, if we do not adjust, then the organisms around us must. In this presentation, Dr. Laurent provides a literature review on how birds have responded to selected human actions and decisions, including the lockdown of spring 2020. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Eunice. I will now pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephanie. And so thank you for also discussing the blurb, and I will go directly into the objectives. So for this presentation, I want to focus on 4 potentially bad situations. And the title is Making the Best Out of a Bad Situation. But the word bad is very subjective. As they say, one man's junk is another man's treasure. So what we might think as bad situations, we're going to see that some birds have actually adjusted their life to deal with these situations. So the 4 situations I want to speak about, the first is urbanization. The second is invasive species. The third is landfills. And then the 4th, of course, is the COVID-19 spring 2020 lockdown. So to begin with urbanization. And urbanization is actually interesting because the majority of our bad situations actually revolves around urbanization. So what is urbanization? It's the process of making an area more urban, and it's an odd definition because you put the word urban in the definition, which is weird, but urban relates to town or city, and then the opposite, of course, would be rural or countryside. So if I was a bird and I saw picture A and picture B, definitely picture A is where I would want to go, right? However, the birds do not have the choice once we build our cities, our towns, etc. So some of the negative impacts of urbanization on the ecosystem is that, number one, it changes species composition, right? It changes biodiversity, because when we cut down trees, build cities, the animals have one of 2 choices, well, 3 choices. Either you move away to a better place, either you adapt, and then the other choice is not a choice, they just might not survive. So we can have a decrease in species composition because either they are now extinct or because they have left the area for something that is better. And this change in species composition means that it influences what is called species interaction. So if I'm a predator and my prey has moved away because of urbanization, now I have something to no, I have a bad situation. So it's like a domino effect. So with the effects of urbanization, things like diet availability. So consider areas that are suburban, right? We use pesticides, we kill the insects. If the insects are gone, birds are affected, other organisms are affected. So like I say, it's a domino effect. But what I really want to focus on is one study that looked at nest building in urban area. So in the rural area, tons of trees and twigs to select from. But in birds that are now in urban areas, they have to find creative ways of making their nest. So the article I'm going to focus on is how this particular group of birds incorporated unique materials into their nest. And the study was done by Suarez Rodriguez et al. And others in Mexico. And what they knew was, let me rewind. The article was about nest building and cigarette butts. So birds were incorporating cigarette butts of smoked cigarettes into their nest. So what they knew going into the study is that country birds generally incorporate, not all, but some country birds incorporate what are called aromatic plants, which release certain chemicals or compounds that act as anti-parasitic chemicals against what are called ectoparasites. So by ectoparasites, we're speaking of things like bird lice, bird mites that live on the birds rather than in the birds. So these aromatic plants in the countryside are beneficial because of their anti-parasitic properties. So what they also saw was that city birds were incorporating cigarette butts into the nest. And we know cigarette also contains chemical compounds like nicotine, which gives off an aroma. So they hypothesized, these cigarette butts, maybe they're having the same benefits as these aromatic plants have for the country birds. So the hypothesis was that cigarette butts may act as an ectoparasite repellent in the nest of city birds. So they did the study in 2011, and they looked specifically at the reproductive season because, of course, that's when the birds are building their nest. And they looked at two particular species, the house sparrow and the house finch. And they chose these two particular species because, number one, they were very prevalent, very common in the cities, in the urban areas in Mexico. And number two, these birds have been known to incorporate cigarette butts into their nest. So the study had two main parts. In the first part, they said, you know what, let's go and collect this nest and let's see how much cigarette fibers are incorporated into this nest and what the effects are on ectoparasites. And then the second part of the study, they said, well, yes, they might incorporate cigarette butts, but is it because it's smoked versus non-smoked? So they did a more manipulative experiment where they compared incorporation of smoked versus non-smoked and then see the effects on the parasite levels. So the result of the first study, where they collected the nest and they measured the fibers, on the x-axis shows the weight. They actually weigh how much of the cigarette butts they were actually incorporating, so the material itself. And then they looked and see how many ectoparasites were actually present in the nest. And what they saw was the more cellulose from cigarette butts that was incorporated into the nest, so going from 0 to 15 grams, there was a decrease in the number of ectoparasites. So if we look at the graph, we can see, okay, so we have 0 to 100, the number of ectoparasites. The more, if you go towards 15 grams, you have a lesser amount of ectoparasites. And when they look at this statistically, they showed here that the weight of the butts has a very low probability, less than 0.05, which means that it actually was significant, that there was a big difference in how much that was being incorporated, and how much ectoparasites were in the nest. They also said, you know what? Is there any difference between the house sparrow and the house finch? So the house sparrow are the dark circles, the house finch are the gray circles, and they saw that there was no significant difference between the different birds. They both incorporated fairly equally similar amount of the cigarette butts. So then the second part of the experiment, where they said, you know what about smoked versus non-smoked? So they manipulated the nest, and they put smoked cigarette butts and non-smoked in the vicinity of the nest, and they compared empty nest with eggs, and the nest in which hatchlings were present. So the smoked is in the gray again, and then the non-smoked is in the black. And what they found was, regardless of the quality of the nest, whether it was empty or it had residents in it, that with the smoked cigarette butts, there were lesser ectoparasites present compared to the non-smoked cigarette butts. So the conclusion from this study was that incorporation of cigarette butts is unfavorable to the ectoparasites. And they said possibly it could be nicotine or some other chemical inside the cigarette is repelling these ectoparasites. So they did raise a couple of questions. The question they raised was, is this self-medication? Are the birds intentionally incorporating the cigarette butts? Are they saying, you know what? Cousin bird told me that cigarette butts are excellent at repelling ectoparasites. I'm gonna make sure I get as much as I can into my nest. Is this some sort of self-medication? So that was one of the questions they left pretty much open at the end of the experiment. So this is situation one. And if you have any question, I can answer them. If not, I have a question for you, which is, what is the strangest bird's nest material you have seen or heard of in your studies as part of the society?
Well, I have a question, and I think this is very intriguing and interesting. And I've always wondered, how do the birds know that the cigarette butts and then smoked versus unsmoked could have these anti-parasitic effects? And so this is a wonderful question that I've thought a lot about. Yes. But I'm right now with UCF helping with their Purple Martin project. And yes, when we do nest checks, I have not seen cigarette butts at all, but we have noticed that they do bring in a lot of fresh green leaves right before they lay eggs and then right before the eggs hatch. And sometimes they incorporate some bark too. And we have wondered, are these leaves they're choosing anti-parasitic? Because they do have lots of those mites you could see on them crawling all over. And so we think it could be for the nesting material, but it could have some aromatic insect repellent. And I think more studies need to be done on that. But I haven't really seen other strange material, but I've heard about the cigarette butts. Okay. Have you heard of other nesting material besides cigarette butts?
So for me, this was the first that I actually caught my attention. I haven't heard of anything else. I do have to say, if I go back to the graph, if it was intentional, I would have expected more birds to have chosen the higher amount than the lesser amount. And I think with Mexico, it's very urbanized. Here in Central Florida, even though we're urban, there's so much greenery, I guess, because of the rules and regulations that you have to plant something if you take out something. So I think our birds here are not as desperate as the birds in Mexico, perhaps.
Yes, and perhaps that they need to find nesting material. So maybe it was by chance, oh, let me pick this up. And then it just happened to have these benefits.
Yes, exactly. Awesome.
Excellent. Thank you.
So if there's no more question, I'll go on to situation number 2.
You can carry on.
Okay, awesome. So situation number 2 is invasive species. And if you have lived in Georgia or Louisiana or Mississippi, this might seem a familiar sight. So this is kudzu. Kudzu vine is pretty much taking over the South. They call it the vine that ate the South. That's how bad it is in these areas. In Florida, that's not our major problem. I will talk about some of the other invasive species that we have here. So invasive species, the NOAA, I always forget the name, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, define invasive species as an organism that causes ecological or economic harm. So keep in mind, it's not just about the animals or the plants, we also worry about our pockets, right? Economy. So they cause ecological or economic harm in a new environment where it is not native. And it's not just animals. We normally think of animals, but plants, even microbes like bacteria can also be invasive species. The opposite, of course, is native species. So yes, peacocks are invasive to Florida. And on the other side here, we have a native species. Anyone can tell me what native bird this is? What bird is this? Native to Florida.
I can answer if nobody in the chat, let me see. Okay, no one has said anything. So I will give my guess. That looks like a mockingbird.
Yes, northern mockingbird, the official bird, state bird of Florida. So that's native, definitely. We love it, it's native. Peacocks are invasive. Some other invasive species we've heard about, of course, the Burmese python is running things down in the Everglades. The lionfish is an aquatic invasive species. FYI, there's a yearly competition with different chefs to see who can make the best lionfish dish. So I guess the idea is if you cannot beat them, you eat them. Iguanas are also invasive. I have not seen them, but as of this year, they are added to the prohibited list. You can't have them as pets. Cuban tree frogs, the climbing fern, mimosa, it's called a silk tree, is invasive. But the one I want to talk about is the water hyacinth. And if you live in Kissimmee and you've been to downtown Kissimmee and you've been to Lake Toho, you've definitely seen water hyacinths. Water hyacinths are invasive. Their native home is South America, and they are so invasive, they're found worldwide on 6 continents except one. The only continent that does not have water hyacinths is Antarctica, probably because it's too cold and probably because they haven't reached that far yet, who knows? But they are invasive worldwide. And I tried to look for something positive for water hyacinths. There were some things, but it was difficult to find what could be beneficial with water hyacinths and birds. When I read different articles, some refer to it as a lake infestation. Some call it a beautiful monster, which is kind of like contradictory. Beautiful flowers, but what it does to the ecosystem is very monstrous. And that's because it forms that thick mat of vegetation. In some areas, it can be so thick, you can actually walk on it. They clog waterways, they block sunlight, they reduce O2 oxygen levels in the water, which means that fish below will die off, because they don't have enough oxygen. And then the bad thing is you might say, you know what, let me get this water hyacinth and chop them into pieces to kill them. But they also reproduce by fragmentation. So if you chop it into pieces, it will actually regrow more water hyacinths. So I searched and I searched and I searched for anything beneficial with water hyacinths and birds. And I found 2 articles, and I'll focus on one, and they were both done in Florida. And to show you how difficult it was to find it, the study was done in 1991, so 30 years ago. And it was done by the management team here in Florida, state management. And what they knew before is that aquatic vegetation is good. Aquatic vegetation provides home for invertebrates. It provides homes for small vertebrates, prey like little fishes, that birds can use as a food source. They also knew that vegetation in shallow waters like Lake Toho compared to vegetation in deep waters like seaweeds in the open water, that the vegetations in the shallow areas are more favorable to birds. So it's awesome to have these aquatic plants in our water. But as I said, water hyacinth and Egeria, they don't know when to stop, right? So they take over things. So they have more negative impacts than positive. So the purpose of the study done 30 years ago was to determine water bird abundance on non-native aquatic plants, and they focused on water hyacinth and then this other aquatic plant, invasive aquatic plant called Egeria, but I'm going to focus on the water hyacinth. The study was done in St. Max River, which is southeast of Tallahassee. It empties out into the Gulf of Mexico, and it was around an 8-week study where they looked at the abundance of different aquatic birds. So what they did was they found different areas on the river where there were mats of water hyacinth or mats of Egeria, and they made sure they were separate. They did not try to find mixed mats. And then they sectioned them with markers, and they viewed the different sections randomly and weekly for 1.5 hours interval from sunrise to noon. And what they found was that there were 3 species of water birds that were more abundant on the water hyacinth. These include the tricolored heron, the little blue heron, and then the common moorhen. And when they looked at the activity, 80% of the activities this bird had on the mats was for foraging. So they were looking for prey, for food. And they limited themselves to the edge of the mat. So they knew better than to try to get into the center of the mat. It would be too thick. So they actually foraged around the edge of the mat. They also observed other birds, but generally these other birds more were on the mats for preening, fluffing out the feathers, taking care of the body, trying to look awesome for the, to catch whoever's attention. But the majority of the purpose was for foraging, okay? Now, the study concluded that the water hyacinth roots provide a favorable habitat for bird prey, so small fish, etc. And they did mention that the study was contrary to what was observed in the previous study done in the late 80s in Orange Lake, Florida. So Orange Lake is southeast of Gainesville, and here we're talking about St. Mark's, southeast of Tallahassee. So I don't know these areas. Maybe the bird population is actually different in these areas, which might account for the differences in the results. But the Orange Lake study found that the common moorhen, the boat-tailed grackles, and the red-winged blackbirds were the most common. So the common moorhen was predominant in both studies. But for the Tallahassee, the tricolored heron and the blue heron was also common. And in their conclusion, they also said that despite these benefits, because 80% foraging, that's impressive. Despite these benefits to these birds, deliberate management of non-native species for bird habitat is doubtful. So pretty much they're saying, tricolored heron, common moorhen, little blue heron, it's awesome that you love these water hyacinths, but we're not going to try to maintain them for you because the cost to the rest of the ecosystem, both ecologically and economically, far outweighs the benefits for 3 species of birds. So definitely not on the list of keep these aquatic plants going. They did say, not the group particularly, but when I Googled the Fish and Wildlife Commission, they did say that trying to eradicate water hyacinth is a futile attempt. Don't even bother try it. The only thing they can do is to manage it and keep it in check. And they said that, yes, indeed, we have it in check. And I can agree because when I was preparing for this presentation, I was planning to pass by Lake Toho and take some pictures of the water hyacinth. But last month, they actually, I guess they treated it. So most of the water hyacinths are actually dead. I guess they did something to the waters, but they're still there. They're coming back. So they do a good job in trying to keep these water hyacinths in check. The authors did say that they did question whether water hyacinth provide a similar quality of habitat to that of native aquatic plants. So are these birds saying, you know what? No, the water hyacinths are so awesome. We prefer to, use these as our foraging sites. Or are the birds saying, you know what? This thing is all over. I'm just making the best out of a bad situation. I'm gonna see what I can get at this, in this in the area, in the edges of these particular plants. So that's the end of study 2. If you don't have a question for me, my question is, when you go bird viewing, possibly at Lake Toho, have you observed bird interacting with the water hyacinths in our local lakes? And any questions? I'm open to those.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
I agree. I've seen so many water hyacinths around Lake Toho, especially if you go to the West Lake Toho and the downtown Kissimmee lakefront area, especially if you go to where the lighthouse area is. So much of that area has filled up with water hyacinth. Now, I haven't checked recently to see if some has been managed, but I've seen it just quickly take over areas. And many times I've gone, I do see some of those same species, the gallinules or the moorhens walking on it, the tricolored herons. I've seen all of them, those similar type of birds walking on it. And it looks like they're foraging as well. And I usually think, it's invasive, get rid of it. But it's so hard. And I thought it was very interesting how you said they have the fragmentation. I didn't know that they could do that, but I know hydrilla also has the same problem. And I had looked into studies about hydrilla management, and a few years ago, I actually went with someone from the South Florida Water Management District. They took me out to look at some of the areas on Lake Toho, and they showed me these mats of the hydrilla. I could see the water hyacinth in areas, but he said that right in the middle of the lake where you have the hydrilla, there's a lot of fish underneath, and the fish, maybe they're laying eggs, but there was always a lot of moorhens all around it. And so the birds know that some of this aquatic vegetation can provide food or cover. And for fishermen, they actually like it because it can help the fish nursery. So I think it's finding that balance between recreation and management, which can be an issue. And then I have to bring up another fact of an exotic species of the apple snail. And as many people know, that's that big snail that is now spreading all over Florida. But they did find a benefit for the Florida snail kite. So numbers have greatly rebounded in areas with the apple snail and limpkins too. So we are seeing some of these invasive species can benefit more endangered birds. But I can see, like, at least from the study of the water hyacinth, the moorhen, grackles, blackbirds, they're common. So people are, we don't really need to protect them as much. But I think it's great that you did find evidence that some of these bird species are using them.
And thanks for confirming, because like I said, that was 30 years ago. I mean, so it's nice to know that they are still actually using, as you said, for foraging, etc. Awesome.
Exactly. Thank you. And let me check real quick if there is, no other questions about that. Okay.
Awesome. So then I'll move on to situation number 3. Situation number 3 is landfills. And landfills are interesting because they're good and they're bad, and they're good and they're bad and they're good, until you don't know, are they good or are they bad? So, and the problem is the thing that makes landfills good are the things that make landfills bad. So landfills are good because it's a place to store our trash. If there were no landfills, then the trash would be in our house, in our yards, in our cities. So it's a place to store the trash. So our cities and our homes are clean. The bad thing is that it is trash and it contains both biodegradable and non-biodegradable materials, which is becoming, a big problem, like the plastics, etc. The good thing is it's the third largest source of human-generated methane, and some are actually looking into landfills and the methane produced as a potential energy source. So some, I don't know, I can't remember which countries or whatever when I did my research, but there are areas are looking into these landfills as a source of energy. The bad news is, yes, it's the third largest source of human-generated methane. What methane is a greenhouse gas, which means it's linked to global warming, to ozone depletion, etc. The good news is an ideal spot for animals to find food and resources. But then the bad news is, as an ideal spot for finding foods, it's also an ideal spot for these animals to pick up antibiotic-resistant bacteria and other things like drugs that we have disposed of, which can actually affect their reproduction and other things. So what's good is the same as what's bad. It's all about the point of view. But what I want to focus on is a study that was done, it was in Europe, about the effect of open landfills on migratory birds, okay? And the article focused mainly on the Eurasian white stork, which are migratory. So the title of the article, well, not quite the title, but it focused on the impact of landfill use on resident white storks, and the research was done by Gilbert and colleagues. So what was known before is that white storks in Europe in the past, that's in the 80s, 70s, all the way before then, were 100% migratory, 100%. They always migrated from the northern parts of Europe down towards the southern parts of Europe and then to Africa during the winter months. But what they found recently is that migratory birds are now partially migratory. So they're not fully migratory any longer. And they noticed there was a correlation with that shift with the emergence of open landfills. Now, another thing that is known is that why do they migrate? Typically, birds that live in non-migratory birds that live in a particular area generally have high breeding success, but their survival decreases during the winter periods because of lack of food. And that's the reason why many birds would migrate, right, to warmer regions. So the purpose of the study was to evaluate the residence of partially migratory European white storks in Iberia. And Iberia is the area we have Portugal, France, and Spain, okay, in the southern part of Europe. They focused on 5 landfills in south-central Portugal. And these landfills were a little bit different than a typical landfill. Generally, when you have landfills, you don't put landfills in your best area. You put landfills in an area that is far away, an area that nobody wants, etc. So these landfills were different in that the area around them had a lot of trees and things. So they were a perfect place for birds to make their nest, etc. Okay. The study was done from 2012 to 2014. And what they did was in the winter, they went to the landfills, active landfills, and they caught and tagged 48 storks. And they chose the winter because if you were migrating, you should not be around. You should be in Africa already. So if you are here during the winter time, that means you have set up residence maybe for just this year, who knows what, but you have set up residence in Iberia, okay? Then they observe the activity of these birds, foraging, nesting, etc. And they compared the breeding season around spring, early summer to the non-breeding season around winter time when the birds would typically migrate. So just to give you a picture of how the migration pattern of the white storks, like I said, the northern part of Europe and regions of Iberia, and this is like just off Northern Africa, like around Gibraltar area, are where they typically nest and breed. And then during the winter times, they migrate to regions in mid-Africa and southern parts of Africa. And then they will return back for the breeding season. So with Iberia, right at the tip is Portugal, and then we have Spain, and then we have France. So they look at two things. They look at the habitat use in breeding versus non-breeding season, meaning, are you hanging out in the landfills? Are you hanging out in the areas around the landfills where you have the trees, the forest? How much time are you actually spend right at your home in the nest, right? And then they look at, okay, if you do spend time in your nest, what are you doing throughout the day, you know, in regards to that nest? So the first graph shows the habitat use. The gray is the non-breeding season. So that would be winter time when they should not be present. And then the white is the breeding season. And what they notice, so the non-landfill area is where the areas around the landfills and around their home, wherever they build their nest, that they can also use to forage for things. And what they saw is that whether it's the breeding season or the winter time, you pretty much spend equal time around this foresty area around the landfills. But what was significant is the landfill use. So before I talk about that, the nest use is not surprising, right? If I'm breeding, definitely I will be spending more time with my nest. So it's expected you will see a difference in how much time you spend at the nest in breeding versus non-breeding season. But the landfill use was what caught the attention, because it showed that during the non-breeding season, when food is scarce, the birds actually spend more times in the landfill looking for resources. And that makes sense, because no matter you live, because resources are scarce, the landfills provide a means of obtaining food. In the breeding season, landfill use was less. And they mentioned that one reason is that the food you obtain in landfills is not ideal for a newborn baby. The parents normally would want things like worms, small soft foods to feed the hatchlings. And when they get mature enough, like we can wean them, like how we wean our babies, then they could shift to landfill as a source of food. So as I said, the two observations from this is there is an increase in time spent in landfills during non-breeding season. But more interestingly, it shows that the birds nested, if you look at here also, mainly in areas close to landfills year-round. And with this year-round, what it means is these birds have indeed set up residence, because we find them both in the non-breeding and the breeding season, and they're using the landfill. So they are in resident. If they had migrated, then in the non-breeding season, we would have a decrease in the number of detections of birds. So the second study looked at how they use the nest throughout the day, or not how they use the nest. How much time were you spending around the nest throughout the day in the non-breeding season versus the breeding season? And what they saw was there was no difference whether it was wintertime or breeding season as to how much time they spent around the nest throughout the day. And this might seem as if, okay, not important results is, boring results. But this result is actually significant, because what they said, and I'm not a bird expert, so you can, verify for me, at the end of this section. But what they said is that birds hang out by their nest to protect their territory. So if a bird is probably hanging around its nest, the areas around the nest, it's protecting its territory. Now, in breeding season, we expect that, right? You have the baby, you're protecting the baby. In non-breeding season, You would expect that if you are a resident bird. But what they said is that migratory birds are not usually territorial during non-breeding season. So basically the bird is saying, you know what, I'm going to the Grand Canyon. I'm going to stop up at a motel. I'm going to stop at a bed and breakfast inn. But if somebody comes to, rob the inn, I'm not going to risk my life to protect it. It's not my territory. I'm just migrating. I'm just passing through. So migratory birds are not usually territorial during non-breeding season. Why bother? I'm going to leave the nest anyway and go down south. So, so that showed, or the researchers said that showed that the birds were actually territorial, that they were actually residential birds. They were no longer migratory. So the conclusion from this study, first, it was the first evidence, the author said, of year-round resident of the white stalks, and that the landfills provided food during winter when food sources were usually scarce. And keep in mind, that's why birds normally migrate, because in the wintertime, food is scarce. And they also mentioned that during breeding season, the non-landfill food sources were preferred, as I mentioned, because the birds want to feed the babies smaller, softer foods like worms, etc., rather than the much harder or larger food sources that they would find in the landfills. One concern they did bring up is something called the European Union Landfill Directive. And the directive is to decrease or reduce the open landfill waste and to increase the number of covered waste processing facilities. So they're not going to process the waste, maybe use some of the waste for energy resources or whatever. So they're going to cut down on open landfills and now have these waste processing facilities. And the concern that the authors mentioned is that closure of the landfills will have a negative impact on white stock populations that are residents and also migratory birds, because normally the landfills can be a stopover point for them as they move, during the end of the year down to Africa. So if you have any questions for me, that would be awesome. If not, my question is, should we promote open landfills to support bird population? So if we had a choice here, should we promote open landfills to support bird populations?
Wow, great question. To be honest, I never even really considered this. I know that if you go to the landfill, you always see lots of birds, but I never really considered the effect of migratory birds and the fact that some of these storks are going from 100% migratory to now residents. I think that's very big. And I wonder how many other bird species are actually adjusting their patterns for that. I feel like it's probably more than just the storks.
Yeah.
So excellent study. And I wonder if this is a great topic for even future research. For example, are populations increasing due to the landfills? Local populations, there might be the migratory groups, but overall, are populations growing? Yes. Are there more sicknesses or diseases with the resident ones that are nesting and feeding from landfills? And so these are all great questions to ask. And you ask a very thought-provoking question. Should we promote them? Because on one hand, I think, no, get rid of them. But then you see, is it actually helping wildlife? Yes. I think it's hard to answer this. Yes. But you raise very great questions.
Thank you. And I think also the birds will find a way. Before landfills, they had a plan. So it might hurt the first year, but eventually they will recover, most likely. And to answer your question, many studies there are studies that have shown negative effects on gulls, because gulls tend to be very common with landfills. So they have had studies where they showed hormonal changes in the birds with a negative effect that has a negative effect on the birds rather than a positive effect. But you're right, it's it's going to be a tough decision, at least for what Europe is going to do. But they're going to do it anyway. They're going to close these landfills. But the birds will find a way. Most likely they'll find a way.
Absolutely. Excellent. Great segment. And I look forward to the next one.
Awesome. So the last situation is the COVID-19 spring 2020 lockdown. And I couldn't find any study in America on the effects on bird. The study was in Europe. But just imagine Central Park, right? Central Park, New York. When the COVID happened and we had that lockdown, many birds, especially city pigeons, right, depend on human feeding them, etc. So imagine the shock, when you come out and there's no humans. What do? We don't think of these things, but these have occurred. So we know the visible effects of COVID-19. It affects our health. It affects our economy. Two major things. And in Florida, we have felt both. Right? We have felt both a lot. But there are many other things that we tend to overlook. And when I was trying to find things on birds, I came across other things, like one article mentioned that acquisition of language in toddlers, right? When a toddler is learning to speak, not only are they hearing the song, they are looking at the mouth to know how to shape, to shape the vowels, to shape the words. So one study said that there's a concern that acquisition of language in toddlers may be negatively affected by COVID-19. Another article I came across said face mask. Dogs, certain animals rely on visual cues of our entire face. So if all what they're saying is the eyes, and there was a vet who did that study or that article, if all what they're saying is the eyes, that might be very disconcerting for some of these animals that rely on visual cues. And then, of course, mask littering, it's everywhere, right? And there was actually an increase in waste quantity during that last year and during the lockdown. And for you all, some effects, of course, is that human-nature interaction. One study in Vermont said there was a decrease in camping, but there was a tremendous increase in gardening and walking at among the greatest increase. And I can testify this was true, because when we had the lockdown, my mom wanted a garden, and I tried to find certain things, certain tools, certain fertilizers, and it was all sold out, even on Amazon. So definitely people went to begin to garden more during that time. But what I want to focus on is the behavioral response of birds to the COVID-19 lockdown. And the study that was done was in Catalonia, Spain, and the study was done on the lockdown period in Spain, which was March 15 to April 13. So it was a 4-week lockdown period. And the goal of this study was to compare pre-COVID bird behavior, so the 5 years before COVID, 2015, 2019, to bird behavior during the 2020 spring lockdown. And they, in the 2015 to 2019, they look at specifically March 15 to April 13. So they try to keep it the same 4-week period throughout the study. So the hypothesis, not necessarily of the authors, but there's a general hypothesis that if urban areas, or even the whole world, is emptied of humans, nature will recover its space. And there's a documentary called After People that showed what would happen if humans suddenly disappear. And we saw how the cities would recover, end up being, going back to the natural state before humans urbanized it, So they said that nature will recover its space if these urban areas are emptied of humans during this lockdown. So they looked at the 16 most common species that are sedentary, meaning non-migratory. So that way, that would not influence the data. And 5 of the 16 species include those I have below: the monk parakeet, the Eurasian collared dove, the goldfinch, and the common blackbird. And there were 2 questions they asked. The first question focused on what occurrence. Did urban birds become more common in these human-emptied cities? And then the second question was about detectability. Were urban birds more detectable as a consequence of quieter cities? So they're asking, in the morning, in the evening, in the night, are they more detectable? So what they did is, one day after the lockdown, they launched a project to collect wildlife records from bird watchers and naturalists. So they already had in place an internet platform in which people, if you go and you do bird watching or looking at just birds and other certain animals, certain mammals, they have this kind of checklist. So these individuals will check and see, when did I see this organism? What was it doing? What time of the day? And they would actually post their data on this platform. And since 2009, the authors mentioned that they have over 6.5 million data records on things that the typical citizens have, observed and recorded on birds and just wildlife. So they launched a project to encourage bird watchers and naturalists to continue their daily data collection. So that way they wouldn't have a lapse, a 4-week lapse in this collection of data. So they reviewed, as I said, the previous data of the same 4-week period from 2015 to 2019, and they divided all the data into 3 sections. The data during the urban lockdown in 2020, the historical urban, which provided a baseline of what would be the normal occurrence or the normal detection in the urban areas. And as a negative control, they included historical non-urban, meaning rural, records of bird activity. And the first one they looked at was occurrence. Were this bird occurring more commonly than before? And the dark circles is before the lockdown, and the open circle is during the lockdown. And what they found was the majority of birds, there was no significant difference. They did what they did. You might see a slight increase, a slight decrease, but significantly, it was not. They did note that 4 birds had a shift. 3 of them increased occurrence. These were the rock dove, which is here, which increased from 60 to 85% occurrence. The monk parakeet, which had around a 15% increase in detection, and then the Eurasian colored dove, which had almost a 25% increase in detection. One bird decreased, that was the European goldfinch. It went from almost 90% detection down to around 75% detection. But the general conclusion was the majority, 75% of the birds, there was no significant difference. So overall, there was no change in occurrence of these birds in the urban areas. So the second graph is about detectability. And this is where they saw a difference. So in the graph, we have 3. We have the orange line shows the data for the lockdown. The gray line shows the data for the normal urban area. And then the purple shows the data for the normal rural areas. And what you want to look at is the shift from the gray to the orange. So the shift between the gray and the orange. So the first thing they notice is that detectability varied along the day. And we expect that. They look at sunrise, midday, and sunset. And as I said, it's expected. I don't expect to see an owl, in midday, unless if I'm on the Galapagos, because they have some very interesting owls over there. But at nighttime is when I expect to see an owl. So obviously, detectability would vary along the day. But what they saw was the greatest change was in the early morning. So at sunrise, if you look at Chloris, we see a shift from 35% detection to 70% detection in the early morning. Same thing, if we look at every organism, all 16 birds, we show 6 here, but all 16 birds had a significant shift from a lesser detection to higher detection in the early morning. And 15 of the 16 birds, that shift matched that of the non-urban, or was close to the non-urban or the rural birds. So for example, in Chloris chloris, we saw it shifted to around 70%. Non-urban birds, you normally have 70% detection of this particular species at sunrise. So the shift tend to then match that of the rural birds. The one exception was the Eurasian blackbird in the lower right corner, Turdus merula. And because the shift did not match that of the non-urban. But that was not surprising because this was the one bird where on the normal conditions, the urban and the non-urban were very similar. But with the COVID-19, it actually shifted differently from both urban and non-urban areas. So the overall take out with this particular result is that there was a major shift in early mornings for these birds, but for the rest of the day, it was not significant. So the conclusions from this study is that the hypothesis was rejected. Nature did not recover its space because the birds still occurred, and at least 75% had no change. Sorry. And the explanations they gave for this is that the COVID, the lockdown was too drastic, too sudden, and in too short a time. So even if they were starting to say, you know what, oh, there's no humans, let's just really change our lifestyle, 1 month was not sufficient. And the second explanation is that the viewers were limited to neighborhoods and areas like parks where they might have gone to see these birds were off limits. So the lockdown in Europe was not like the lockdown in America. It was a lockdown. I mean, it was like prison. It was a lockdown. And so they could not go out to certain areas where they would normally go to view the birds. They were limited to their neighborhoods, to their houses. You know, they were actually in their house and they could only go out once a day to the grocery in some, to do grocery shopping in some areas, you know, or maybe like twice a week. So the lockdown was very drastic, very strict. The explanation for the increase in detectability at dawn is that, of course, birds rely on sound for communication. And it just so happened that the lockdown was launched at the start of breeding season. And the birds were, you know, interested in singing to get their partners. And they normally choose to sing at the optimal time. And dawn is the optimal time because sound transmits better at that time. So with the removal of all the background noise that normally we would see in an urban area, the bird's optimal time actually shifted to an earlier time. So this is the study from the lockdown. So my question to you, if you don't have any questions for me, is did you observe any changes in bird activities during our lockdown here in Florida?
Great information. And I'll admit during lockdown, me personally, I didn't go out birding or nature hiking as many people did a lot of that, but I didn't as much. But from my home, I observed the normal amounts. It seemed like the normal birds that usually come to my house. Although there was, I do get oven birds. I did see more of them foraging in the leaves, but that wasn't until like last fall.
Okay.
But it seemed like the normal amount of birds were there. But a few times I did go to the Kissimmee lakefront and I noticed a lot more snail kites. I don't know if that has anything to do with the lockdown, or is that because of the snails? But I did notice more than I had previously seen at other times. So I hadn't really noticed, but one good thing maybe to look at is eBird, that's the local app people can use to report bird sightings. It's called eBird. Okay. And that data would be interesting to look at.
Yes.
for the locally in Florida or
Yes.
county wise, and you can compare it to previous years.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that way you could see specific species. Is there an increase or not?
Yes.
Compared to other years.
Awesome.
But
Awesome.
I think you do raise an interesting point about the morning time, because everybody is so busy in the morning. They're getting ready for work, they're on their commute, they're starting the day very early. It creates a lot of noise, especially in urban areas. And so I can see if that is now quieted down, the birds are taking advantage of that
Yes.
in the morning, especially during breeding time.
Awesome. And actually, you brought up something interesting, because now I'm wondering, could it be that the humans changed and we're now doing more detection at the early point because they were actually at home? So it's a very good, that's a very good observation.
Exactly. Now, because I did heard a lot of birding and bird watching did increase over the past year, and so because of the lockdown. And so that raises another question. Is it because more people are looking, therefore there's more observations? And it could be that too. So we don't really know. But I do think it's good that even in Europe, and I know in the United States, more people are watching, and then they could put it with the eBird, which is like a citizen science app and program. So excellent information.
Thank you. So that's pretty much it. So keep in mind, if we don't adjust, then the organisms around us must. Okay. And these are my citations, many, many citations. So if there's any questions, I am free to answer any questions.
I do have one question. If anyone would like to get in touch with you, what is the best way they can do that?
Actually, for me, my Valencia, that's my personal email, but my Valencia contact information is actually the best contact information. And I didn't give, oh, you have my email.
Yes. So after the presentation, I could get that from you, and then I'll put it in the description, and then it's whatever appropriate contact info. If anyone wants to reach out, if they have any questions, they can certainly do that.
Yes. Definitely.
And thank you so much for coming this evening. What a great presentation. Very interesting research, relevant research to the world today, the interactions of birds and humans. And some birds, they have no choice but to adjust to human behavior. And so thank you very much for coming this evening, and have a good night.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay, I just ended